Hello, my name is Travis, and welcome back to Approachable Napa. Now, over time, as I've tasted more wines from across Napa's multiple AVAs, I've come to really appreciate how different mountain blends and mountain cabs are from what most people picture up when they think of a Napa Valley red. Mountain wines have a very distinct personality. They're more structured, they're more powerful, sometimes they're more rugged, and I think that they're incredible expressions of the territory that their grapes are grown in. I also think there's a little bit of a gap in how these regions are explained. Most content online that I've seen focuses either on Napa as a whole or individual wineries, but not so much on comparing these mountain AVAs side by side. If you're a wine enthusiast, I guess you might be able to taste the difference between two mountain cab bottles, but understanding the nuance between each mountain range is specific knowledge that I don't think is very well disseminated. So in this video, I'll walk through the major Napa Mountain AVAs, how elevation and terrain shape the wines, and I'll also give you some producers from each region, which will hopefully encourage you to pick up a bottle or two, do a side-by-side tasting, or maybe even line up the regions in a blind tasting. My recommendations will feature bottles with the specific AVA listed on the label, meaning 85% of the grapes must come from that AVA. I will only include vineyard designated wines if the vineyard is well known and clearly tied to that AVA. And that's because if a wine is vineyard designated, then it has 95% of the grapes come from that vineyard, and the vineyard is likely on that in that AVA region, right? So for today's video, I've got two wines, a Pine and Brown Spring Mountain District Reserve 2023 and a St. Viator Mount Veeder Revelation Block 2023. Two very fantastic budget wines. They will not break the bank, and they give you a great introduction to what some of these regions can taste like. Now, mountain vineyards create different wines for very specific reasons. At higher elevations, you get larger swings between daytime and nighttime temperatures, and that's called a diurnal shift. Warm days allow the grapes to ripen fully, and then the cooler nights slow down respiration in the grapes, which preserves that natural acidity. And that acidity is what keeps wines fresh and structured instead of soft or flat. You also got to consider the fog line in Napa. That's usually around 1,000 to 1,500 feet. And below that line, vineyards are more influenced by morning fog, which delays ripening. And above that line, they get more consistent sunlight. So that leads to even more ripening and subsequently a more uniform flavor and aromatic profile. Another key factor is soil. Mountain soils are shallow, rocky, low in nutrients, and that's really going to limit vine growth and stress that vine. You're going to get smaller berries with thicker skins, and the skins of the grape contain most of the tannin, the color, the flavor compounds. And more skin relative to juice means more structure, more intensity, and likely more aging potential too. Another part of the mountains is water drainage. It's critical. Mountain soils drain quickly because of the kind of soil and slope. It creates very controlled water stress, which reduces yields and concentrates the fruit even further. The result is wines with higher natural acidity, more tannin from thicker skins, and a greater concentration of all of the compounds that contribute to structure and long-term aging ability. Mountain wines are typically more expensive too, because like I mentioned, the yields are lower. And you've got steep vineyards that require more manual labor. And farming is, well, simply more difficult, right, on a mountain. You get less wine and it takes more work to produce it essentially. Now, Cabernet Sauvignon, it dominates these regions. It's not really the only grape grown there. Merlot can be used in these wines, soften the tannins, add mid-palate richness. You see some Cab Franc in these as well for aromatics like herbs and floral notes. Petit Verdot adds structure, color, intensity. These grapes are really important in mountain wines because tannin levels can naturally be very high, and so that blending helps create balance. Uh, we see Zinfandel historically planted on mountain sites, and that's because it performs well with the drainage of soils and the high sun exposure, giving bold, fruit-driven wines. It's just that Cab Sauvignon has taken over Napa Valley due to a much higher return on investment for planting it. So you simply don't see as much Zinfandel. Now, each mountain has a pretty substantial range in elevation. That doesn't necessarily mean that you'll find vineyards across that entire range of elevation. The vineyards are set up where growing conditions are the most favorable. So that means you tend to see vineyards pop up in clusters around certain elevation points and around certain slopes. So instead of using total elevation to describe all of this, I've organized Napa's mountain AVAs in a rank order by average functional vineyard distribution. So this will give you a sense of which way each AVA will lean as far as structure, acidity, and flavor profile. And I'll also put up a table in the video to help contain all the information I talk about. But keep in mind the descriptors are going to be comparing one mountain AVA to another, not necessarily all the other regions and the valley floor. So we'll start with Diamond Mountain. The vineyards are generally planted between about 600 and 1,300 feet, with the mountain itself reaching roughly 2,200 feet. What distinguishes this region is its geological diversity. You get a mix of volcanic and sedimentary soils, along with varied slope exposures, and that's going to create meaningful differences in how vineyards retain water and accumulate heat. There is consistent sunlight and slightly warmer growing conditions, which allows for more complete fruit development without necessarily losing a sense of balance of tannin and acidity. The wines are likely going to show more mid-palate weight and roundness while still maintaining structure. Tannins are more present and feel slightly broader, and the fruit profile of this region moves more towards black and riper expressions like black cherry and cocoa, which creates a style that sits between restraint and richness. So there's going to be more polish and accessibility, but still clear mountain structure. For Diamond Mountain on the entry level, you could look at Vineyard 511. You could also consider Martin Ray Diamond Mountain Cab or Sterling Vineyards Reserve Diamond Mountain District Cab for the mid-tier. And at the high end, J. Davies Estate Cabernet Sauvignon would work really well. And at the highest end, there's Diamond Creek. You get Volcanic Hill, Red Rock Terrace, Gravelly Meadow. Those are the three vineyards which produce. It's a foundational producer for the entire AVA, even though the label just reads Napa Valley. So I have to mention them. Now, when we talk about Mount Veeder, they're typically planted between about 800 and 1,500 feet, even though the mountain itself rises roughly to 2,600 to 2,700 feet. Most vineyard sites sit on a lower to mid elevations, but the terrain is very steep. So that's going to affect that drainage, the exposure, the vine stress, even at lower altitudes. So this places it slightly higher topographically than Diamond Mountain on average, but still within that same lower to mid elevation band. The region is strongly influenced by marine air from the San Pablo Bay. So that's going to keep temperatures cooler and it's going to slow that ripening a bit. Now, as a result, acidity stays very high. Fruit development is more restrained. You've got dense forest cover limiting direct sunlight and creating more subtle variation between each vineyard site. And that depends on the slope of each vineyard and the canopy openings. So wines are generally going to reflect the conditions of their vineyard then, which means on average they'll be lighter in body compared to other mountain AVAs, with higher acidity driving the structure rather than the tannin alone. Tannins are still present, they're just finer and less aggressive. So the fruit profile is less about ripeness and more about tension, which is going to show earthiness, herbs, and when you compare that to the rest of Napa's mountains, this is one of the least plush, most linear, and most restraint-driven styles, which I think almost mimics like a lean, old world styled wine. Now, for entry levels, the Weiss wine produces a great Veeder cab, a reliable introduction. Mid-range is Mount Brave and Robert Craig Mount Veeder cabs. I think they have more depth and structure while still staying true to the AVA's restraint and acidity. And at the high end, Maya Kama's Mount Veeder cab is one of the defining wines of the AVA and really highlights the freshness and long-term aging potential of the region. Let's talk about Spring Mountain. Spring Mountain vineyards typically planted about 1,000 and 2,000 feet, while the mountain rises to roughly 2,600 feet. So this gives it one of the widest functional planting ranges among the mountain AVAs. And it is one of the most environmentally complex regions in Napa. You get dense forest cover, irregular topography, shifting slope orientations. So you get a wide range of microclimates within these short distances. Some vineyard sites will receive full sun, others will get filtered or intermittent light. So you get a lot of variation in temperature and ripening patterns, even within the same mountain range in this case. And because of that variability, the wines tend to emphasize complexity over sheer power. Tannins are moderate rather than dominant. Acidity is going to be balanced rather than extreme. The flavor profile often includes both red and dark fruit, along with some herbal and savory elements. So compare this to like Diamond Mountain, the wines are less about polish and more about nuance, greater aromatic detail, and less emphasis on density. For Spring Mountain entry level, Smith Madrone Spring Mountain Cab is an amazing best value purchase. A very pure expression of the AVA. Mid tier Keenan Reserve Cabernet, which is the Spring Mountain District label on that is fantastic. More concentration, structure, still maintains the balance and nuance. And at the high end, Vineyard 7 and 8 Spring Mountain District Cab presents a very premium expression of the AVA, greater depth, polish, and complexity while still reflecting the mountain's layered aromatic style. Philip Togni Estate Cab is also a high-end, very important wine from Spring Mountain, even though the bottle solely reads Napa Valley. Excuse me. This is a Spring Mountain Cab through and through, so I really have to include it here. Let's move to Atlas Peak. Atlas Peak vineyards are generally planted about 1,400 and 2,000 feet, with the mountain rising to roughly 26 to 2,700 feet. Most plantings sit on a broad elevated plateau rather than steep slopes here, though. And that plateau structure is very unique. It creates consistent and intense sun exposure, minimal shading from trees. At the same time, the elevation allows for cooler nights, which helps preserve acidity. That's even as fruit reaches full ripeness. So compared to Spring Mountain, there's far less variation in sunlight, in microclimate, and you'll get a lot more uniform ripening. The wines show a noticeable shift towards power and fruit expression, particularly with the blue and black fruits. There is more ripeness than in Diamond or Spring Mountain, and more mid-palate weight as well. Tannins are very firm, clearly defined, but not as dense as somewhere like Howell Mountain. Acidity is going to remain present to give the wine some lift, but overall impression is, I think, likely more driven by fruit intensity and clarity rather than by restraint. So this creates a style that feels bold with a balance between ripeness and structure. For wine recommendations from Atlas Peak, Con Creek's AVA series has a great Atlas Peak cab. In the mid-tier, I would consider Acumen Peak Cabernet. Their Adcora vineyard is their highest elevation bottling, one of the highest elevations in all of the AVA, if you want a really unique profile. A lot of mid and high-end Atlas Peak fruit comes from what's called the Stagecoach Vineyard. So if you find a bottle with that on the label, it's worth picking up. Awe Summit Atlas Peak Cabernet Sauvignon is a perfect example of a high-end bottle. So I'd pick that up if you want a premium expression. So now let's go to Howell Mountain. Planted between 1,600 and 2,400 feet, the mountain range is going to be roughly 2,600 feet. This gives it the highest average vineyard elevation among Napa's mountain AVAs. Most sites here sit well above the fog line, which results in consistent sunlight throughout the entire growing season. Howell Mountain vineyards are more concentrated at higher elevations, which is going to create more uniform growing environment, fewer shading or cooling interruptions for the grapes. And the soils are volcanic and highly porous. So there's rapid drainage, increased vine stress, and when you combine that with high elevation, you combine that with the sunlight, you get very small berries with very thick skins and high concentration of tannin. So the wines are mostly structurally intense, and tannins are high. They're dominant more than any mountain AVA, and it's supported by strong fruit concentration as well, which gives the wine a sense of density and weight, and acidity is going to be very high and noticeably present, but it's going to play a secondary role compared to the structure and fruit depth. Compare this to Atlas Peak. the wines are less about precision and more about power, with a darker, more saturated profile and significantly greater aging potential. So for wines from Howell Mountain, entry-level option would be Cade Howell Mountain Cabernet is what comes to mind. In the mid-tier, La Jota Mountain Cabernet is a classic, widely recognized expression. It's a fantastic bottle. And at the highest end, you can look at like Dunn Vineyards Howell Mountain Cab as one of the most structured and age-worthy wines of that Napa AVA. So if you step back and compare these regions, the differences come down to temperature, sunlight, soil, and elevation, all working together in slightly different ways. Diamond Mountain adds structure with greater balance and geological variation. Mount Veeder is coolest and most influenced by marine air, producing higher acidity wines with more restraint. Spring Mountain is the most complex environmentally speaking, in my opinion, which is going to give you more nuanced and aromatic wines. Atlas Peak is going to give you high elevation and strong sun exposure to produce powerful but still balanced wines. And Howell Mountain is going to emphasize consistency, structure, ageability through elevation and volcanic soils. Now, you may have noticed I did not mention Lokoya for any of the producers that I recommended, which is an absolute cardinal sin in the wine world. Lokoya is unique. They produce separate Cabernets from multiple mountain AVAs. That includes Diamond, Howell, Spring, Veeder, which makes them one of the best producers for all of mountain wines and comparing how the regions differ. They are a benchmark producer for all high-end Napa Mountain AVAs. So I didn't want to recommend them for any of the single AVA categories because they would just take the cake for a lot of high-end bottles. If you can get a bottle of Lokoya, it's a huge win regardless of AVA. I hope you learned something from this video. You could probably see why mountain cabs are some of my favorites to enjoy. So thanks for watching Approachable Napa.